You probably have a pretty good idea of Europe, and since most of you are from the Western world, probably a good idea of their history if you've ever played video games, seen a movie, or gone to school. As quickly as possible, I'm going to run through the entire history of a place with countless civilizations, cultures, and peoples. Europe as a place isn't culturally, religiously, or geographically unified, but we call it a continent anyway. Because none of the continents are. Continent is a weird word. Part of why I love history is seeing why the world is the way it is today. How did we get from feudalism to today's capitalism? How did Europe cease its endless wars it was so fond of? Why are a handful of countries in Western Europe so powerful globally? So let's go back to one of the most pivotal events of the Middle Ages, the Black Plague. Fleas lived upon rats carrying the bubonic plague from Mongolian ships, feasting on European cities which were interconnected by trade and featured dense civilian populations that are uncommon in history. It killed up to 60% of Europeans, and the continent would not recover its population for almost 200 years. This sort of sudden shift has large cultural and societal repercussions. Suddenly farmland was left unattended. Feudalism, a system where unpaid labourers worked the land for a lord in return for protection, began to collapse, particularly in the West as wages rose and food became plenty, at least until the plagues returned. Grain prices rose at first as well, so there wasn't a real improvement in quality of life for a while, so the real shake-up is in terms of the culture. During this same time, in 1328, the French king died with no heirs. The English king Edward III saw himself in line for the throne through his mother, and the French disagreed. They weren't going to have an Englishman sit on the French throne. An on and off conflict occurred for 116 years, dubbed the 100 Years' War. At the beginning of the 100 Years' War, a land dispute between two crowns had instigated a routine conflict, calling on the banners for a feudal war. This happens all throughout the medieval era. But by the end, professional troops had taken over, nationalism had taken root, so it was now the people of England versus the people of France, and the country's paths for the future had been set. Aided by the ravaging effects of the Black Death, the culture was reshaped. England, which had been the aggressor in the 100 Years' War, invading mainland Europe, would give up conquering Europe forever as it began construction of the strongest navy the world had ever seen, and one that arguably wouldn't be rivaled until America took over as a superpower centuries later, and France created a powerful, professional, highly trained land-based army, which would eventually be used by Napoleon to attempt at conquering all of Europe. Secular curiosity was on the rise towards the end of this bloody medieval era. The sacking of Constantinople scattered Greek intellectuals across Europe, coinciding with the invention of the printing press, and with it higher literacy rates that weren't entirely associated with the church, as had been the case for centuries. The setting was ripe for something special. The Catholic Church faced many crises which had peasants questioning their authority, like the failed Crusades, a period with 3 popes and a poor response to the Black Death. God's wrath doesn't really cut it as an excuse when it's at this scale, giving way to secularism or the things of the world rather than the things of the afterlife. This was a period of culturally reviving Europe's old Greco-Roman roots, spreading outwards from Italy, a cultural and economic centre with connections to the Islamic world. The Industrial Revolution was the rise of machines, steam power, and the factory system, originating in Britain and gradually spreading outwards. It has been called the most important event in human history since the domestication of plants and animals. The Industrial Revolution brought cities to a whole new level. For the majority of history, 80% of a country's people, at the very least, lived outside of cities. It wasn't until 1850 that the sudden urbanisation caused by the efficiency of machines had driven cities to actually have more people than the rural areas. It saw a consistent increase in the standard of living for the first time in history, though how long this took is debatable. While once there had been 2 clear classes of wealthy aristocrats and peasants, with few in between, now there was a growing middle class. Initially, this sudden change to society was jarring. Skilled professionals were suddenly outstripped by machines, rendering their career extinct, most prominently in the textile industry. Machines are really good at sewing. Poverty was everywhere. Obvious to see how the rise of socialism, Marxism, an ideology based around equality and common ownership came about. A government which served the wealthy elite, they were who could vote, and a citizenry worked half to death, including children under the age of 15. The spread of the Industrial Revolution is what made the most destructive wars the world has ever seen in history possible. For 4 years, the Allied powers of France, Britain, Russia, and the United States fought Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire across the globe, but predominantly in Europe. World War I was a war fought by battleships, bombing planes, machine guns, armoured cars, and artillery. All recent industrial innovations applied to 19th century war tactics to a tragic human life toll. The vast scale and destruction of World War I, as caused by the industrialized might of the great empires at war, is what led to the wide-reaching ramifications of the war. Interconnected ideologies were taking root across the globe. the monarchies in Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire fell to communism, democracy, and single-party rule. This sort of destruction could never be allowed to happen again, so the precursor to the United Nations was created. The rise of fascism in Germany as a result of their crippling World War I reparations, the rise of Imperial Japan as a result of their prosperity depending on exporting luxury items like silk in return for raw resources like coal, which was a poor business model during the Great Depression, and a meek response from the international community to aggression. World War II was a tragedy on an unimaginable scale. It featured crimes against humanity and civilian massacres that dwarfed World War I. 6 million Jews dead, not counting the other undesirables, 60 million people killed globally, untold destruction throughout the globe. A clash of ideologies, militaristic expansionism, anti-Semitism, extreme nationalism, and technological breakthroughs culminated to reshape the world as we know it. World War II was a truly global war and will be covered in every continent I make a video about. But the chief European consequences were the dividing of Europe along ideological lines as the Soviets conquered and converted Eastern Europe under their Iron Curtain and the Americans the West, and the final blow to colonialism, which had been weakened after World War I. For the first time since the Middle Ages, Europe didn't hold the reins to hegemony on the world stage. The role of world leader had been surrendered from colonial European powers to America and the Soviets. Europe was finally stable. The borders largely haven't changed to this day. The might of nuclear weaponry as demonstrated by the Americans in 1945 has ushered in a period of long relative peace. Never again is firmly in the minds of most Europeans. There was an idea to make war in Europe unthinkable. To entwine European economies so closely, initially in the production of raw resources like coal and steel, particularly in the Western European liberal democracies, so war would be impossible. This was implemented by joint institutions in the 60s and expanded to what we know as the European Union in 1992, which has evolved to have its own currency, freedom of movement, freedom to trade, a shared citizenship, and a shared law, with many countries opting out of various rules for various reasons. This brings us to Europe today. Europe is a continent with democracy in various forms as its predominant government style, Christianity in various forms as its predominant religion, English as an understandable language by a slim majority, the European Union in various forms as an overarching government in many countries, and a shared culture with debatable components. Some say the culture of Europe is Greek philosophy, Roman laws, and Christian values. A constantly evolving series of states that are feeding each other with ideas. As globalization increases throughout the world, the Western world as a theological and cultural concept might become harder to define. Or maybe it won't. That's not the purpose of this video. I'll leave it up to you. At least now you'll understand a fraction of a percent of the events that has gone into creating Europe we know today. Maybe in the future we'll be able to talk properly about the plethora of topics that didn't make it into this video. Military, art and ethnic histories, a closer look at Eastern Europe's history, ancient history, Islamic and Judeo history, etc, etc. I could go on forever. There's no limit to the depth of history. If you like my style of content, I suggest you subscribe. I do plan to make more videos about European history, although the next couple lined up are about New Zealand. I've linked in the description a handful of books that I think would be a great resource if you want to know more right now, and please like this video if you liked it. My social medias are in the description as well. If you want to connect with me, ask me questions, or you can just leave a comment down below.